Hello everybody. Today we are going to be going through and looking at all of the Hexawan cards. This is probably going to be the most controversial of these reviews just because of the nature of a lot of the Hexawan cards. Before we even get into this, I'm going to go ahead and state some of the rules pertaining to structures that the game doesn't exactly make clear. So, structures are anything that's not an enemy, a pet, or the player. That means the rocks on the field that show up sometimes are structures, volcanoes are structures, hazards, the snake capsules, those are structures. Even hostages, friendly hostages, are structures. Also, structures are kind of inconsistent with the way they're printed on the card. Like, some of these structures don't really do what the card says they do. The damage numbers are inconsistent. Some of the structures show the HP on the card, some of the structures show the damage on the card. Most structures, when you drop them on something, will do damage equal to your HP to that something, and vice versa. But there are some structures that break this rule for whatever reason. So what I've done is I've gone through and tested all these cards and taken notes on them just so that I have accurate numbers to work with here. Let's get into this because this is probably going to be a long one. And some of these cards are kind of complicated. Alright, so Beacon. It's bad. I don't know what else you want me to say. It's one of the ones that's doing 80 damage when you drop it on something. That's okay, I guess, but actually using it as a structure is just bad. It's RNG reliant. It just gets in the way. It rarely does anything. And when it does do something, it's not that impressive. Really, this card's just terrible. Stay away from it. So, beam crystals. It doesn't state this on the card, but each of the crystals do 75 damage in a piercing laser when they're destroyed. So this card's okay. It's the kind of card that's decent on Gunner or Break Hazel. Break Hazel especially because she thrives on these kind of cards. But outside of those two, this just isn't doing enough. Like, for all these cards like Beam Crystals to be really good, you need to have a way to break it yourself without sacrificing too many resources. So Gunner and Break Hazel can take advantage of these types of things, but other characters kind of... it's just not good enough on other characters. Blast Crystals. The damage of the shot that these things fire is 150, which is pretty good, actually. So, in theory, this could do 300 damage to a single target. This card's really good on Break Hazel. On other characters, I mean, you'd mostly be using this as a meat wall, but I don't think that's that good of an idea. Spending 2 mana just to get these crystals out here to block some stuff is it's questionable. A lot of times they might get in the way. Like, it's not as bad as with other structures, because if you have to destroy them, at least you're getting something out of it. But overall, I don't think using structures to block stuff, exclusively to block stuff, is the best idea, because it's just way too finicky, and there's some risks involved with that. Like, they might end up blocking your shots more than the enemies, and a lot of times I I just don't want to deal with that. It makes it too complicated. So take this on Break Terra and maybe Gunner if you're interested. Otherwise, this is Like, it can be good. The damage rating on this is really high. So if you're really skilled with this card in particular, then sure, you can make it work. But if that's not the case, I just wouldn't bother. Unless, of course, you're playing one of the loadouts that can abuse this. Blue bullets. So we're shooting 20 times, and it's doing damage equal to our current mana. Gunner starts with this. The current mana thing is kind of pointless in my opinion, because most of the time if you're using blue bullets, it's because you have spell power and on-hit stuff going on. You don't really care about the max mana thing. So, as for how good this card is, I don't think it pulls weight well enough in the early game if you don't already have some synergies going on with it. I would not take this card just by itself and hope it becomes good. This is the kind of card that you want to take after you already have the artifacts that are going to make this good, and then you pick this up and it's great. On Gunner, it's just kind of weird. Like, he has a thing going on with Innervate as well, but then you have to use Innervate, and it's just too convoluted. But on him, it's okay. It's not great. It's about what you would expect from a card in your starting loadout. Bomb Toss. This is one of the ones that kind of breaks the rules on the card text. So you throw a bomb, it explodes when destroyed. The way this works is the bomb has 150, not 100, the bomb has 50 HP. And if it lands on something, it's going to do 150 damage to that something. But the bomb doesn't work the same way as other structures, where if it has... Actually, no. No, I'm not thinking about this right. So, if you throw the bomb and it lands on something, then it's going to do 150 damage to that something. And if the thing it landed on had less than 50 HP, the bomb is going to spawn onto the field with the difference in HP. If that makes sense. That's the way all these structures work, but because bomb does way more damage than its HP when it lands on something, it's a bit more finicky. Most structures, like take Beacon for instance, if you drop it on top of something, it's kind of like it compares the HP of the beacon to the HP of the thing it's being dropped on, and whichever one has higher HP is the one that gets to stay and occupy the tile. And it's the one that's staying is also taking damage equal to the HP the other entity had. Like if you drop the beacon on, say, a 60 HP enemy or a 60 HP structure or whatever, then the beacon's going to destroy that entity and it's going to spawn in with 20 HP. That's the way this works. Now, Bomb Toss, I think this card's actually pretty strong because if it hits the thing, then you're doing 150 damage for 2 mana. If it doesn't hit the thing, you're probably eventually doing 150 damage for 2 mana anyway with a little bit more investment. It's kind of an underrated card in my opinion because the damage rate for the mana is really good, and you can, if you can aim it right, you can have this either be AoE or not be AoE, depending on what you need in the moment. On Gunner, of course, you can use this to restore mana, that's why it's in his starting deck. But on Break Hazel, I would stay away from this because it just doesn't make sense with her power. Bombard. This card's bad. Like, the damage numbers are really good. This is another one of those cards where the numbers are there, but the functionality is just terrible. Firstly, this can never hit the front enemy column unless something super weird is going on with the structures. Additionally, it's just there's a pretty decent delay on when you cast this to when it's actually hitting. So getting into a situation where you're actually hitting with this thing is just really difficult. The only enemies that this is really going to be good against is stationary enemies. If you're running a structure deck and you're planning on fighting the wall, this is one that I would take, however, because it's very useful there. But if that's not the case, and you just have some conventional stuff going on, even if you're heavily banking on turrets or crystals or what have you because you're playing one of the Hazel loadouts, I would still stay away from this because it's just dead too often. So if you're playing one of those two loadouts and specifically planning on fighting the wall, you might want to consider this if you're kind of doubting that you have enough damage. Otherwise, just avoid it. It's too finicky. Castle. So this card is pretty strong in my opinion. It summons 3 gun turrets, which are these things. And actually, I think it will make more sense to talk about the gun turret first, so we're kind of going to break order here. So the gun turret, it's kind of like Hazel's build loadout bread and butter. You summon the turret, it has 120 HP. It shoots like once per second, about, I want to say, and the shots deal 20 damage. So on Build Hazel, this is your bread and butter. It's in your starting loadout, and it's probably going to be the card that you bank on for most of the run. Now, the problem with this whole strategy is it falls apart against bosses like Shiso, who have the ability to push your turrets back and lock you in. But the other problem is if the turrets are getting destroyed too fast, then you're just going to have serious issues. Because the gun turret on Build Hazel is kind of a snowbally card, right? On other characters besides Build Hazel, even on Break Hazel, I would stay away from this. Because on her, it's just too mana inefficient for what you want to be doing. But on Build Hazel, I would be cautious with the gun turret, and I'd kind of recommend having a backup plan just in case. Because sometimes this just isn't going to work out. If the enemy damage is outpacing how fast you're able to deploy these things and shield them up, you're going to have serious problems. But if that's not the case, then these gun turrets can do great work. Now, back to Castle. For 5 mana, you're summoning 3 gun turrets in a column. So if you're getting all 3 turrets, that's 9 mana worth of turrets, so this is really mana efficient. And the big thing here is it consumes. So it's not in the way after you deploy it. So even on characters besides Build Hazel, you can take Castle, and in normal fights it's going to be really strong because it's just going to stunt enemy attacks and do okay damage. It kind of falls off in the later parts of the game though. But in boss fights, you can drop this, and then when the boss inevitably shreds through the turrets like they always do, it's out of the deck, so you don't have to cast it anymore. So I think it's pretty alright on just about everyone if you have the mana to afford it. Unlike a lot of the other high mana cost spells, this one doesn't benefit as much from upgrades because double cast is terrible on it, which is kind of unfortunate. So cross turret, this is in the category of high risk, high reward, because the shots do 80 damage, and I want to say they shoot about every 2.5 seconds. So if you can make this work, it's very good, because you can use it really well on room fights and some boss fights to kind of lock the enemies or boss in place, and then it can do considerable damage over time to them. Now, in room fights, if you can position this behind an enemy, then it's pretty good, because then you don't even have to worry about it hitting you. However, all that being said, the risk of this thing hitting you is pretty scary, because 80 damage is quite a bit of damage. So if this hits you even once, then it probably wasn't worth it. But if you can manage to finagle scare situations where you can make this work and not get hit by it, then it's pretty okay. But personally, I think the risk associated with it is a bit too high, and I tend to avoid it because the reward just doesn't justify the risk. Next up, we got Grail. So this one, you throw it down, and if it survives for 4 seconds, you heal 50 HP and gain 10 money. It consumes. This is kind of a deck agnostic card, because none of the structure synergies actually do anything with this. So really, you just take this if you want it when it shows up, and you try to milk value out of it. You try to milk that money out of it to buy more stuff, to snowball into a good run. Personally, the times I would take this, it's kind of like a lot of the similar cards where you want to take this as early as possible. If it's showing up on like stage 6, then maybe you might want to skip it. But if you're getting this on like stage 3 or even stage 4, maybe 5, then I think that the value you're getting from it is going to be worth the mana cost over all these fights. Big thing with this is just knowing where to place it so that it doesn't get yeeted. Usually that's going to be somewhere on the enemy front column, but sometimes that's not the case. It kind of just comes with learning the game. We already talked about gun turret, laser turret. This one is, in my opinion, like gun turret, but for people other than Build Hazel. I think the laser turret is a bit worse than the gun turret on Build Hazel, but on everyone else I would much rather have the laser turret, because this one's doing 80 damage piercing shots. It's shooting about every 2.5 seconds, so it's doing considerable damage, but the big thing again is it consumes. So on fights where it's good, you throw it down, and on the fights where it's good, it tends to be really good. On those fights, you just throw it out there, and on the fights where it's bad, you just throw it out there. It's probably going to get just destroyed near instantly a lot of the time on those fights. And then it's out of deck, so you don't have to worry about it anymore. So where this is good is on some specific boss fights and in quite a few room battles. In a lot of room battles, there are going to be a lot of enemies that just don't have the ability to deal with this if you place it in their front column. Like, they just can't touch it. And especially against stationary enemies, and when you start to get better at learning the enemy movement patterns, you can put this in a position where it's just going to continue firing and have no risk that it gets destroyed, and it's just going to kill the enemies by itself. And since it's piercing, there are some room battles where this is really good, because it just can clear entire rows of enemies out. So, personally, I think this is another one people are kind of underrating because they're not thinking about it right. They look at all these structures and they think, oh, we have to play this on Hazel, but Laser Turret is a structure that's kind of for everyone but Hazel. You don't want this on Hazel, you want this on everyone else. Mana Lattice. Okay, so this one is kind of bizarre because the first thought with these kind of things is, oh, we put them on Break Hazel or Gunner. But the problem there is Break Hazel and Gunner don't really care about the 4 mana restoration because they're already restoring all their mana off just hitting the lattice. So it's kind of useless on Break Hazel. On Build Hazel, it's also kind of useless because it doesn't give you any benefit besides giving you back mana if it gets destroyed. But the problem here is on Build Hazel, tile economy with your structures tends to be really important, so placing this thing down and risking it clogging up the field is just not the best idea. On everyone else, this is okay. It's kind of like a mana fusion that's glued onto a structure. If you can make it work, then of course it's very good because we're already comparing it to mana fusion. But if you're less experienced at the game and you're not going to be able to throw this out and it immediately gets hit by some big attack that's going to destroy it, I would stay away from this because I think if you can't get this to pop and you have to spend cards and mana popping it yourself, it's not that great because then the usefulness is kind of gone and you're just stuck with this mana lattice on the field. And a lot of times you're going to fall into this trick of you throw the mana lattice down and then nothing hits it and you just let it sit there and it's taking up space and wasting your time. So if you can make this work, if you're good at making this work, great, then it's a spectacular card. But if not, unless you're trying to learn how to use this, then I would avoid it. Mine. This one is kind of hard to talk about because it's just such a binary card. Like, if you can get them step on the mine, then 250 damage for 2 mana is an insane rate. But a lot of the time it's just going to be 2 mana, do nothing. So if you're trying to do something cute with the mine and some movement spells, you can go for that. If you don't have any way to manipulate the enemy into walking into it, then I don't think this is worth it because the risk of spending 2 mana to do nothing is a very real risk. And when that happens, the card's just terrible. If you can find a way to get enemies to move into it, then the rate's pretty good, but at that point, I feel like your whole strategy is kind of questionable. So overall, I don't know about mine. Maybe you can make it work. Maybe you've figured out how to make it good even. But personally, I don't care for it. It's just too difficult to make use of. So next up we got Minefield. This one is one of the cards that punishes enemies who move a lot. Like a lot of bosses like Celicy or Shiso or Gunner get really punished by Minefield. Or Terra as well. So 2 mana for 30 damage. Mines on every tile. If every enemy on the field is just getting hit by this once, the card's bad. So how many times do we want this to hit things? before it becomes good. I would say for this to feel okay, you'd want to hit with at least 3 mines, then you don't feel terrible about it. At 4 mines, this becomes decent. At 5 plus mines, this is a really good card. So the reason I think that Minefield is pretty solid is because it does a good job at hard countering a lot of the trickier bosses that can be really difficult to land stuff on in their later stages, like the aforementioned Shiso or Celicy. It's really good against those bosses. In room battles, it's kind of a mixed bag. Overall, I would take this if you feel like you're going to have trouble against those particular bosses. If you have other ways of dealing with those bosses already, then you can still take it, but it loses a lot of value because this is, in my opinion, a card just for countering those bosses. Also, it's kind of deck agnostic. It has a little bit of synergy with on-hit and spell power stuff, but not really. You can fit this in wherever you want it. Minigun. This one starts in the Saffron Chrono loadout as well as the Hazel build loadout. This card is pretty solid. It's kind of overrated in my opinion when you put it next to a lot of other cards. I know a lot of people get really excited about Minigun, and I'm not totally sure why. Like, I get that it has really good spell power scaling and really good on-hit scaling, but there are other cards that do the same thing, like blue bullets or even just some flame stuff can do the same thing. Overall, I do think this is a good card. I just think it's overhyped a little bit. So, if you have the synergy stuff to go with it already, then I would take it. If it's really early and you're just desperate for some damage, go ahead and take it. But if you're in the mid game and you don't already have some stuff that's going to synergize with this, then I don't know about this, because keep in mind, bosses get defense every stage. So if you're on stage 4 and you see Minigun and you don't have any spell power, this thing's going to do a total of 12 damage to the boss, assuming you hit all the shots. That's kind of what gets Minigun. What makes it not good all the time is the defense on bosses, and on some enemies if you're playing on hell modes. So it's a good card. If you start with it, great. If you get it really, really early and you can plan to get stuff to make it remain relevant, great. But if it's mid-game and you don't have anything that makes this relevant, don't just take this. It's not going to pull its weight well enough. Next up, we got Monument. This one is kind of strange. It's another one where not all the stuff it does is listed on the card. So this does follow the normal rules of dropping on top of stuff. It's going to do 250 damage if you do that. But when you break the thing and you drop the walls on top of the enemies, it's going to do 250 damage plus the 40 damage from the walls, which again we're going to go ahead and skip ahead and talk about here. Walls are one of the structures that break the rules set in place that most ER structures follow. If you drop a wall on top of something, it's only going to do 40 damage. I don't know why, that's just the way it is. But the wall itself is 0 mana, and you just summon this brick. It doesn't do anything. It's kind of a very complex card, because It doesn't cost anything, and there's a lot you can do with it. However, there's also the potential that it could get in the way. Like, you don't want to drop the wall and then you don't have anything to do with it, so you're just sitting here like, oh no, I gotta clear out this wall now that I put here for whatever reason. But if you can get mileage out of this, then that's great. It goes without saying that on Build Hazel, or not Build Hazel, this is terrible on Build Hazel for the same reason Mana Lass is kind of questionable on her. I meant to say on Break Hazel, this card is just your bread and butter, essentially. The difference between having a wall available and not having a wall available on Break Hazel is night and day. But take it on, well, no, don't take it on Break Hazel because you start with it. Or do take it if you're on loops, but it's very good on Break Hazel. It's atrocious on Build Hazel. It's above the average for itself on Gunner. On everyone else, it kind of comes down to how creative you are with this thing. You can use it like a mini thunder that just hits right in front of you, if that's what you're looking to do with it, but you can also use it to block stuff. You can use it to disrupt enemy movement patterns, etc., etc. Like, there's a lot you can do with it, but it's the kind of card you need to experiment with yourself. I'm not going to go too much further in depth about the wall because it's the kind of card that I can talk about for just an hour plus and we'd still not reach a conclusion on it. Just know that the wall, if you're playing at a near perfect skill level, is a very powerful card, but that decreases drastically depending on your skill level. Like, if you're still newer to the game, I would stay away from this. If you're kind of intermediate, experiment with it sometimes, but just be aware that it can screw you sometimes. So, back to the monument. You summon this monument, it's going to throw out, I believe, 4 walls in front of itself when it goes down, and any enemies hit by those are going to take 250 damage, plus the additional 40 from the wall coming down on them, so this is doing 290 damage total. Except the monument does actually have 250 HP, which can be kind of a pain to grind through if you're not playing someone who has a way to cheat it out. On Gunner, this is pretty decent because you can use it to restore mana, of course. You can use any structures for that. But on not on Build Hazel, on Break Hazel, this is especially good because you can just instantly destroy it on command. It's really good on her. The damage numbers are very, very high on this card. So it's one of those where if you can make it work, that's great. But a lot of times you can't make it work because your character just isn't that kind of character, or you don't have the resources available to make this worth it, because actually grinding through the HP to structure is kind of pointless, because at that point you dealt 250 damage to the monument when you could have just done that damage to the enemies instead, and you spent 2 mana and went through all this hassle. Now, the wall structures that get thrown down on the enemy field, I don't really know how good that is. It's hard to think about because it's a very situation dependent card in terms of the structures it's actually throwing out there. So that one just depends. Take this if you can make it work. If you can't make it work, you know you can't make it work, and you shouldn't take this. Salvage. So this is kind of a interesting one. This card is a bit redundant on Break Hazel, except being able to get 100 shield for 1 mana is a pretty good rate. So it might be worth taking on her still. But the places where you really want this are if you're playing something besides Break Hazel and you already have some non-consuming structures in the deck. This card, I do believe, is a very good idea to take on Build Hazel because it can bail you out of some terrible situations where something happens like Shiso locks you into the corner with your own turrets. It can bail you out of those spots. Or even if a turret gets pushed into a weird position on your side of the field, deal with that. It can also kind of fix your mistakes. Like, if you put a turret in a really bad spot and you kind of want it out of the way, then you can just use salvage to do that and get 100 shield. It's kind of a failsafe on Build Hazel, and generally it's the kind of card I like to have in the deck, even if I don't use it sometimes, because sure, sometimes it's going to be useless, but unlike other cards that are useless sometimes, this is one where when you do need it, you really, really need it. And if you don't have it, you could just die. Like, this card could actually save your life on Build Hazel. And on other characters who want to do some stuff with structures, it's the same sort of deal. So, really, I think if you're doing anything with structures at all, anything that's core to your strategy, and not stuff like Shard Toss or Bomb, I would take Salvage, because it's just a very important effect. Next up, we got Shard Toss. So, the way this one works is the shards can land on enemies, but they cannot land on other structures. The shards will never land on top of a structure. So the shards do 50 damage if they land on enemy, or 50 damage when they explode, and they cannot destroy each other unless there was some double cast stuff going on. Then the shards can destroy each other. This is kind of a card I feel a lot of people overrate when they're new to the game, but then when they inevitably realize this card's not that good, they write it off entirely and they never take it again. I think this card is somewhere in between there. If you don't have any ways to take advantage of the crystals on the other side of the field, then it's pretty mediocre. But if you do have ways to take advantage of those, then it's very, very strong. On Build Hazel, this is very, very strong because you're getting shield off this. On Break Hazel, not so much. Well, actually, speaking of maybe... No, it actually is worth it on Break Hazel, because on Break Hazel, or if you're trying to do this stuff on Gunner, or any character where you have a lot of stuff going on with structures, you're probably going to end up taking cards like Sidewinder or Volley. And then having 1 mana creates 2 structures suddenly becomes pretty solid, because it makes your Volley more likely to shoot off. It adds 2 missiles to your Sidewinder, so I would take it in those situations. But if you have nothing going on with structures, stay away from it. Shield Gen. Okay, so this one's like the definition of trying to snowball a fight. The dream with Shield Gen is you drop the Shield Gen, then shortly afterwards, you draw it again and drop another shield gen next to the existing shield gen. Then they're giving each other shields, and then you can stand there and get shields from both of them, and then you can put more of them down. But in reality, a lot of times the shield gens are just gonna get destroyed by bosses or even just normal enemies too fast to matter. In room battles, even if the enemies aren't going to destroy these, I just think your mana is a bit better spent just killing the enemies rather than throwing this thing out here and trying to scale, because doing this weird scaling stuff just doesn't make sense in these short room battles. On boss battles, you can make this work, but this is one of the structures you have to drop on your side of the field, so it's going to get in the way, and there's no way around that. Additionally, bosses tend to destroy these pretty quickly, so the plan of getting the shield gens stacking on top of each other isn't terribly realistic. This is more of a gimmick strategy, in my opinion, but disregarding that strategy, how good is this by itself on boss fights? Because it's terrible in room battles. On boss fights, honestly, I'd rather just have a card that gives me the shield up front, because this is just too much complexity and too much weird stuff going around a card that is ultimately just giving you shield, when you could just take a more straightforward approach and take something like shields up instead. I don't care for this card. I know some people swear by it, but personally I think it's just kind of mediocre. I think a lot of people are just thinking about the best case scenario with shield gen and kind of losing sight of what's actually going to happen most of the time. Shotgun. So this card, if the dude's right in front of you, is going to hit for 300 damage, which is really strong. It's actually quite a bit better than I thought it was at first glance, because that ability to do 300 damage for 2 mana directly in front of you matters a lot more often than you would think. There are a lot of enemies and a lot of bosses that this is really important against. Like on Celicy, when she's getting in your face and trying to slash you, the shotgun can do a chunk on her. Against Riva, she likes to spend a lot of times in the front lines. Against Hazel, she spams out all these structures, and sometimes you just need help dealing with them. This deals with all that stuff. It's also good against the Grim Reapers, the knights, the spear knights that like to get in your face and try to stab you. Anything in the front row, it's okay against stuff in the second row. But really, this is another one of those cards where I think how good it is when it is good is worth the situations where it's terrible, because the mana efficiency is just so high. Additionally, of note, this is a card that I really like to pick up on Build Hazel, because Build Hazel has a hard time dealing with enemies that get right up in her face, and it can also kind of serve the same role as Salvage if you need it to. So this is, in my opinion, about average, but not quite, because there are some situations where it's useless, and there are some situations where it's really good. So if you're offered this card and you're thinking about taking it, what you want to consider is how bad are the situations that's really good in for me. Like, if I have a really hard time dealing with the stuff that Shotgun is very good against, then you should probably take Shotgun. But if you're already really well equipped to deal with those situations, then I would avoid shotgun because you don't need it. Sidewinder. This one is 50 damage missiles for each structure on the field. This doesn't have to be your structures, this is any structure. The shots work the same way as Earth Tomb in the way they fire, so they can miss if the enemy's moving, and they probably will miss a lot of time. But this is one that I think is kind of like a late game card for these structure decks, but the payoff isn't that good. It can be really strong in some room battles where there are just a bunch of structures scattered about already when you load into a room. On boss fights, this is okay. Really, I think this card's okay. It's not gonna really impress you like some other cards, but if you're already really invested into a structure strategy, or a structure strategy, because some structures don't play nice together, then definitely take this, because, I mean, why not? It's going to be a efficient rate. If you have 4 structures on the field, then this is a really efficient rate, even though it's going to miss a lot of the time. Yeah, there's not much else to say about this. Take it if you have a lot of structures, otherwise just don't. Super minigun. So, this one is pretty strong. It's firing 100 shots, and that's really what we're here for, because this is probably one of the best enablers in the game for on-hit stuff and spell power. The 2 times 100 damage, if you don't have anything that synergizes with this, that's kind of but it's acceptable enough that I think you take this anyway, because the high roll on this is very powerful, and it can just delete stuff. So unless you have a really good reason not to take this, I would take this most of the time. Sweeper. This one's kind of mediocre. It's 2 mana to do the thing that the guys that like to shoot their gun and new players always run into it and get hit by it over and over and over. It's that thing. But this card's mediocre. Realistically, what you're going to expect is this hits everything on the field for 60 damage for 2 mana. That's a terrible rate. It's going to hit twice on some stuff if it moves the right way, but I wouldn't count on that. Really, this one's just a mediocre damage card. It doesn't really synergize with anything. It's okay against the wall, but that's about it. Turret SD. It summons an SD turret. The SD turret has 100 HP. It deals 100 damage if you drop it on something, but if you try to drop something on the SD turret, it is going to fire at you, so keep that in mind. So this is another structure that I think is pretty agnostic because it consumes. I think you've noticed by now that I tend to prefer to take structures that consume on strategies that aren't dedicated structure strategies. The SD turret itself, it's going to... the way it damages stuff is kind of weird to explain. Whenever it gets hit, it's going to launch a volley of 20 damage shots at the enemy tile, depending on how long it's being hit for. Usually when this gets hit, it's going to do 60 damage to something. And usually you can expect this to do 100 damage to stuff if you don't have any upgrades on it. It's okay. It's pretty decent on some boss fights, as well as against some enemies that do a lot of really small damage shots. It can kind of shred those. But this is one that's kind of just slightly above average on everyone, I would say. On Build Hazel, you can make this a bit better because you can give it spell power and give it shield so it can keep getting hit and not get destroyed. But really, I think this card's just a little bit above average. If you want the SD turret, you can take it. If you don't want it, then you don't have to take it. And finally, we got Volley. Volley is the last payoff for going into a structure strategy. I think this card's just kind of average because sometimes you're just not going to be able to make it work, and I think that's kind of what kills the card. It does have a bit of AoE potential, but you have to already have a structure in the right place at the right time for Volley to work. And 1 mana for her damage is just kind of... well, it's a good rate, but there's some very real stipulations here. Unless you're really, really deeply invested into the structure strategy, I don't know if I would care to take this. And even if you are really deeply invested in it, I still don't know if I would care to take this because there are just better things you can be doing with that strategy than throwing out the Volley. Because the real problem is that there's no reality where you can guarantee this is going to hit. Even if you're really deeply invested, sometimes you're just not going to be able to make this work. And that's what kills the card, in my opinion. If you're playing like a Build or Break Hazel and you just need damage right now, then sure, go ahead and take Volley. Otherwise, the card's pretty mediocre. And we already talked about Wall, so that covers all the Hexawan cards. This was probably one of the weirder regions overall, just because of the nature of their stuff. And I imagine there's gonna be a... like, I feel like this is just the most controversial region, just because of what they do. So inevitably, I'm sure there's going to be some things you disagreed with on this video, but that's just the way it's going to be. So next time, we'll talk about Kinesis. Until then, I'll see you guys later.